Hi, everybody. Welcome and welcome back to our regular updates, our regular check-in with Michael Koplow, our partner, our friend from Israel Policy Forum. Thank you all for being here. I want to acknowledge that today is our second to last day of Hanukkah. We're heading into our final night tonight. And in this time of bringing more light into the world, light can bring joy, it can mean joy, but it can also mean just a greater understanding of the world around us. And that is exactly the light that Michael has been bringing to us these last couple of months. This is our final update with Michael for the calendar year. So I hope we'll all get a chance to thank him before he's done today. So again, Michael, I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you so much for being back with us once again.
Thank you, Rabbi Berman, and good to see everybody. Okay, so since we last did this, things have, of course, been moving in different directions when it comes to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. At the moment, Israel is starting to contemplate moving into what's effectively going to be the final phase of what can be deemed the sort of heavy military operations that have characterized the war so far. And what that means is that Israel is still operating in northern Gaza, of course, particularly in the Jabalia and Sajaiya neighborhoods and refugee camps, which is where Hamas's largest strongholds are in the north. And it's been operating in Khan Yunis, which is something that began since we last spoke, in southern Gaza. And what we've seen already in southern Gaza is a bit of a difference from the campaign in the north, where the campaign in the north was far more comprehensive in terms of territory. Whereas in the south, because you now have about 1.8 or maybe even 1.9 Palestinians in southern Gaza out of the total population of 2.3 million, it means that Israel has had to limit where it's operating. And so it's focused mostly on Khan Yunis, has not really engaged in Rafah, which is the neighborhood in the southernmost part of Gaza that borders Egypt, as much. Hasn't really engaged along the coast as much, which is where the large humanitarian zone is set up, and has also not engaged all that much in sort of central Gaza. So it's really been focusing on Khan Yunis. And what's taking place now is effectively a push and pull, which has been reported this morning, both in the Israeli press and in the American press, between the US and Israel over how much longer this is going to go on and at what point Israel transitions into the next phase. And you effectively have US officials who are there constantly trying to figure this out. At the moment, it is Jake Sullivan. Over the weekend, it's going to be General Brown, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and following him, it's going to be Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense. So there's a real push taking place right now to figure out between the United States and Israel how much longer this phase of the military operation goes on. We've also seen, I think, over the past few days, more comments, or I should say, perhaps more strident comments that we've seen from President Biden about the need for Israel to start to wrap things up. And I would have told you this a week ago as well, before any of this was reported, but my own sense from speaking both to US government officials and to Israelis and to Israeli colleagues is that this probably goes until some point in January, and then it's going to move to the next phase. And what the next phase looks like is not going to be a withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza. It's going to be likely a pullback of the IDF from population centers in Gaza to a security zone or a buffer zone of 2 to 3 kilometers that Israel establishes. Something I should note that the US still wants to avoid, but I'm not sure it's actually avoidable. And at that point, you will have the IDF making routine raids into Gaza to take out Hamas cells and Hamas officials. And I'd say that if before the end of this current phase, They have not yet located and killed people like Yahya Sinwar or Mohammed Deif. I think it's likely that these raids will be even more frequent and heavy. So that's going to be a next phase, and the question is when that transition happens. There is also now much more intense discussion about what happens once this transition has been made, and you start to have to figure out what the transitional phase for Gaza, forget about the Israeli military operation, but what the transitional phase for Gaza is between the heavy phase of the military operation and whatever long-term arrangement is going to be in Gaza. I'll do a bit of self-promotion at the moment, which is that my colleague Shira Efron and I released a report earlier this week laying out what we think that transitional phase should look like in terms of security arrangements, administrative arrangements, and humanitarian arrangements. You can find it on Israel Policy Forum's website, so I encourage people to read it if they are interested. It's not very long, only about 12 pages, I think. But at the moment, you do have these conversations taking place between the United States and Israel over what that looks like. And a lot of the focus, particularly over the past 2 or 3 days, has been about the dispute between the United States and Israel over the role of the Palestinian Authority. And that is more of a long-term dispute because the US and pretty much every outside actor in the region is of the view that ultimately the Palestinian Authority should be the entity that returns to Gaza and takes over its administration, whereas Prime Minister Netanyahu has, in some instances, ruled that out definitively. In some instances, ruled it out without major changes in the Palestinian Authority. And so this is more of a long-term argument about what happens at the end of the transitional phase. But it does impact the transitional phase as well, because in any transitional phase, everybody, Israel, the United States, everyone, is hoping, I was going to say counting on, but it's really hoping for states in the region to come and help solve some of the problems in Gaza, which are enormous in terms of humanitarian assistance provision and in terms of reconstruction. It's going to require lots of money. It's going to require lots of planning. It's going to require lots of oversight. And without some plan, whether it means PA involvement or something else, none of this will happen. And the states in the region in particular are not willing to just dump a whole bunch of money into Gaza without a sense that there's a plan for rebuilding, without a sense that there's a plan for the long term, without a sense that there's going to be some sort of political movement. And so this all becomes much harder unless Prime Minister Netanyahu drops his PA objection or comes up with an alternative plan that anybody else will accept. So it isn't really, even though it seems like it's an argument about the long term, it really is an argument that's hampering any type of planning for the immediate day after, which is not, again, about the long term, but is just about the transitional period. It's also worth mentioning the West Bank because, of course, things are still happening there. Since we last spoke, the Palestinian death toll inside the West Bank since October 7th now sits at, I think, 276. The Israeli death toll remains at 4. And this is now day number 3 of an ongoing Israeli military operation inside of the Jenin refugee camp, which before October 7th and since October 7th remains really the locus of terrorist activity inside the West Bank. It is a particular Islamic Jihad stronghold, and obviously there's a large Hamas presence in Jenin as well. So that is now going on 3 days, again, something that would normally be getting lots of attention, but has been subsumed by what's taking place in Gaza. A few other things that are worth noting. The Israeli government today passed a supplemental budget to cover the costs of the war. And so they approved all sorts of things, including a higher budget deficit than they were prepared to live with when they passed the original budget. And they also repurposed some coalition funds to different things for the cost of the war, including funds to resettle people who have evacuated from northern and southern Israel, financial assistance, all sorts of things like that, civilian security arrangements. But they did not repurpose all of the discretionary funding. There's still a lot of discretionary funding in the supplemental budget for the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox school system, and there's about 300 million shekel, so about $75-80 million that is still going to the settlements and national missions or national projects ministry, which is sort of this new nebulous ministry that was created under this government that effectively spends money inside of the West Bank on settlements in a largely unaccountable way. So as a result of the discretionary funding that was approved for these sorts of things, Benny Gantz's party, Hamachana Hamamachti, the National Unity Party, did not vote in favor of the budget. And there were also 2 Likud members who did not vote in favor of the budget, one who abstained and one who just didn't show up, presumably on purpose. So the budget passed, but it did not pass with the full backing of either the current unity government or even Prime Minister Netanyahu's original coalition. The other thing to note of importance that happened this week was Khalil Shikaki, who does quarterly polling of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, released his latest poll, and it showed a number of trends, some interesting, some worrisome. One of the trends that he identified in his polling, which has been getting a lot of attention, is huge support among Palestinians for the October 7th attacks, over 70%. Although in that same poll, it demonstrated that while Palestinians support it, I think the number was that about 10%, or maybe even fewer than 10% of Palestinians didn't actually believe that Hamas carried out atrocities during the attack. So a huge number support it, but even larger numbers don't think that any atrocities were committed in the course of the attack. The other thing it demonstrated is that, unsurprisingly, support for Hamas is up inside of the West Bank, although it is down inside of Gaza. And in general, it confirms this continuing split between the West Bank and Gaza, where in the West Bank, Hamas is more popular because Palestinians there tend to dislike Fatah and the Palestinian Authority because they live under that's who governs them in an unpopular way. And in Gaza, Hamas is far less popular, again, because Hamas has been in control of Gaza, and so Palestinians in Gaza tend to not like Hamas. And in addition, many of them are very angry about the results of this operation and what's been happening. And so what you see is that when you ask Palestinians who should control Gaza after the war, 75% of Palestinians in the West Bank say Hamas, whereas only 38% of Palestinians in Gaza say Hamas. I should also note, by the way, that we should probably take all of these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt, since polling in Gaza at the moment, Khalil Shikaki is an excellent pollster. I have no idea how he conducted a reliable poll in Gaza, so that should be factored in, and it should also be factored in that historically, as demonstrated in these polls, which Dr. Shikaki has been doing now for 2 decades, when there is fighting between Israel and Hamas, in the immediate aftermath, support for Hamas always goes up, and then a couple of months later falls back down to where it was, and we're certainly still in that period. So as I said, I would take all these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt, but they do demonstrate that Hamas is being blamed by Palestinians in Gaza. Not to say that Israel is not being blamed more, but Hamas certainly is being blamed by Palestinians in Gaza for what is happening. Whereas in the West Bank, given that West Bank Palestinians don't see any viable alternative, Hamas's popularity has skyrocketed. And I would just note that this, more than anything else, points to the need to provide Palestinians with some sort of viable alternative that is not the Hamas approach. So that's the update. And with that, I am happy to answer people's questions.
Thank you, Michael. Please put your questions in the chat as they pop up into your head. The question that came up, pretty much at the beginning, just I guess clarifying question about the moving of Israeli troops to a buffer zone. Is this buffer zone in Gaza? Is it between Gaza, Israel? What does that
So
look like?
this will likely be a 2 to 3 kilometer buffer zone inside of Gaza. And the idea being that in order to protect the border communities in the south that were devastated on October 7th, you cannot allow any Palestinians within 2 to 3 kilometers of the border. One reason for that is to prevent an infiltration. And so if you see anybody in that no man's zone, the procedures will almost certainly be shoot to kill on sight, no questions asked. And the other reason is that those communities historically have been vulnerable to mortars, which have basically a 2 to 3 kilometer range. And so in order to prevent any mortars being shot at those communities going forward, especially because there is no warning, there is no effective warning system for a mortar, you literally hear the mortar whistling, the whistle of the mortar coming, and you duck. So the idea is that 2 to 3 kilometers will also prevent mortars going forward.
Thanks. A question that I have is, so we talked about Hamas and Fatah, and I know right now with the war going on, it's very hard to kind of see grassroots organizing and all of that. But are there alternatives to either of those ruling parties for Palestinians to perhaps cling on to for hope, or for a different type of collaboration with Israel?
Not really, because Palestinian politics has been completely ossified now for decades. And part of what we've seen is you have violent jihadi groups that are more extreme than Hamas that exist, but they don't have any interest in Palestinian politics. Islamic Jihad is the most prominent one of these, where Hamas has, of course, a military wing and then an ostensible political wing. Groups like Islamic Jihad and ones even more to their farther extreme don't even pretend, right? They don't bother with a political wing. So you have more extremist groups, but they aren't interested in politics. And within the sort of Fatah Palestinian Authority space, Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, but really Abbas, have done a good job and a comprehensive job of making sure that no real challenger exists. And so what we've seen in the past are splits within Fatah, and we saw that before the Palestinian elections that were supposed to happen in 2021, but then were canceled. And they were canceled because Fatah was splintering into 3 different groups, and Mahmoud Abbas did not want to take that chance or tolerate it, and so elections were canceled. And so you have Fatah dissidents, but it's very difficult in a pretty tightly controlled authoritarian political system, which is what the Palestinian Authority is, to have any real alternatives or opposition emerge. And one of the things that's going to have to happen, if there's going to be any PA role in Gaza, or if the PA is going to be remotely successful in the West Bank going forward, which they have not really been to date, is PA reforms that allow the opening of the political system and eventually elections. But that has not happened yet, and it's something that the United States absolutely needs to press the Palestinian Authority on.
We have a question from Jamie about any comments on the north and what is going on with Hezbollah.
That is an arena that is heating up pretty quickly, and I think I mentioned last time in the wake of my trip to Israel that one of the things I heard consistently across the board was a determination that Israel was going to have to act militarily if Hezbollah was not going to relocate north of the Litani River. That has not changed, and what has happened since, particularly in the last few days, are far more vigorous and public Israeli statements to that effect. There are diplomatic efforts taking place behind the scenes, and the idea there is to basically lean on the Lebanese government to have the Lebanese army occupy that space in the south and basically move Hezbollah north of the Litani River, because Israel would rather have the Lebanese army there than have Hezbollah there. And that may yet yield fruit. It may be that with enough pressure from the United States and France and other countries that have influence with the Lebanese, that can happen. I'm a bit skeptical. I wouldn't put a high chance on it, but those are the efforts that are taking place. If those efforts fail, then there will almost certainly be an Israeli military operation that is designed to drive Hezbollah basically 7 kilometers north of where they are now. And if that happens, I think we can expect that there will be Hezbollah missiles coming pretty quickly across all of Israel, not just in the north. So that remains a very distinct possibility, and things certainly are heating up in that arena.
I also have a question from Gary. Can you speak about the capture of Hamas agents in Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany? Specifically, I'm personally wondering if the situation helps Israel gain support for fighting off authoritarian terrorists. How will this encourage Western democracies to grow their support for Israel? So yeah, just opening up to that.
Yeah, I don't think it's very smart for Hamas to be conducting these types of operations overseas. Obviously, I find it abhorrent, but beyond that, I think it's stupid for the reasons that are implied in the question. European governments have, for a very long time, had issues with jihadi movements inside of their borders. We've seen this in all sorts of European capitals. Terrorist attacks in London and Paris and other places. And so the more that European governments believe that they have a terrorism problem that is inside of their borders, the more they're going to crack down on it, and the more they're probably going to move to restrict immigration from Middle Eastern and North African countries. I think part of this is the explanation for the rise in right-wing populist nationalist movements inside of Europe. And I think within more right of center parties, for sure, sympathy for Israel is going to increase as a result. And Hamas traditionally operates inside of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Traditionally has not really extended its operations beyond those borders. To the extent that it's doing so now, that's obviously a worrisome development. And I hope that European governments are able to crack down on it as quickly and as comprehensively as possible.
So the final question, and 2 people brought this up, any update on what we might expect to see with the fate of the hostages, any evolution of the releasing of them, any updates?
There is a lot of hope inside of Israeli circles that the current military operation, which is going well, is putting more pressure on Hamas and will eventually lead to within the next couple of weeks another type of deal, as we saw earlier. There was an interesting report in the Israeli press today that the head of the Mossad was supposed to be traveling to Qatar to have proactive talks with the Qataris about a hostage release, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu prevented him from going. And his position is that Israel should not be initiating these types of things. They should wait for Hamas and the Qataris to approach them. So we'll see. As I said, there is hope that Israel's military operation will spur another round of negotiations and hostage releases. But as the same thing applies now as applies last time, which is that it's very difficult, and it's even more difficult now because in some ways the low-hanging fruits when we think of the hostages are the ones who were released, the women and the children, the women who remain for terrible reasons Hamas does not want to let go, and then it's men and soldiers. And so it's a harder lift, and the cost that will be requested, at least I'm certain, will be higher. And also, as Israel's military operations have expanded, there have been reports from hostages who came back that there are hostages who've been killed, some by Hamas and some, tragically and inadvertently by Israeli military operations. So I think all of this makes it far more complicated than the first time. But we should all be hoping and praying that there is another hostage release, because the more hostages, of course, that come home safe and sound, the better this will be, irrespective of Hamas's fate, and irrespective of how the military campaign is going.
Thank you, Michael. We're getting comments in the chat thanking you for all of these weeks helping us to understand a terribly complicated and challenging time. And I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's. So thank you for these weekly debriefs or bi-weekly, and thank you for everyone coming in and informing yourselves about what's going on. I put in the chat 2 links. Next week on Tuesday, December 19th, we'll be having our final Navigating Israel's Crisis program with Shalom Hartman. This one will be focusing on Torah and how this can replenish our souls and our spirits during this time. And I also put in the link for Central Stance with Israel, which includes all of our previous talks with Michael, as well as some other programs. So please keep on the lookout for Israel programming and all other programming coming to you as the year concludes and as the new year starts. So again, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Hanukkah Sameach.